Evelyn Mitchell sat alone in the quiet, sterile waiting room of the Texas Medical Center, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She had been pacing for what felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been 40 minutes since she had given Daniel samples to the lab. Daniel himself was away on a business trip, refusing time and again to take his stomach pain seriously. He had brushed it off with the same words he always used. "It's just stress, Evelyn. Don't worry." But Evelyn worried. She had noticed the hollowness in his cheeks, the sallow tint of his skin, and the way his suits had begun to hang loosely on his frame. Even their neighbor had asked if Daniel was ill. For weeks, she had begged him to get checked, and when he pushed her away with his dismissive charm, she had done what she thought best. She went to the doctor herself, asking them to review his earlier blood work and order additional scans in his absence. Now, sitting there, she could feel dread crawling up her spine. The door opened, and the oncologist stepped in, holding a file pressed against his chest. His expression was carefully neutral, but Evelyn had spent enough years as Daniel's wife to recognize what someone looked like when they were about to deliver bad news. "Mrs. Mitchell," the doctor began gently, pulling out a chair across from her. "We need to run a few more tests to confirm, but the scans raise some serious concerns. There are masses in his liver and lymph nodes." At this stage, he hesitated, choosing his words. "It may be advanced cancer." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Cancer." Her voice cracked. "We'll only know the full picture after a biopsy," he continued, speaking with the practiced calm of someone who had said these words far too many times. "But we need to prepare for the possibility that it's stage 4. I know this is a lot to take in." The words echoed in her head. Stage 4 metastasis, no guarantees. For a moment, the room spun. She gripped the edge of the chair, fighting the urge to break down right there. Her first instinct was to call Daniel, to beg him to come home immediately. But she stopped herself. How could she tell him something so devastating over the phone, while he was hundreds of miles away in meetings surrounded by colleagues? No, if he was going to hear this, it had to be from her, face to face. She would have to be the one to steady him, to remind him that there was still hope. When the doctor left, Evelyn sat frozen, staring at the stack of pamphlets he had left behind. Living with cancer, support for families, treatment options. They felt like lead in her hands. Slowly, she slipped them into her purse, as though hiding them would make the truth vanish. On the drive home, the memories came flooding back, the 10 years that had led them here. She remembered the beginning, when she and Daniel were newly married, 20-somethings with nothing but determination and a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Houston. Daniel had promised her the world, his arm wrapped around her shoulders as he whispered, "You'll never regret marrying me. I'll build us a life where you'll never have to want for anything." And he had tried. He worked late nights, poured every ounce of energy into his fledgling business, while Evelyn kept their modest apartment in order, dreaming of the family they would someday raise together. Then, just a year into their marriage, she discovered she was pregnant. She had been so sure Daniel would be thrilled. But instead of the joyous embrace she imagined, he had frowned, pacing their cramped kitchen. "Evelyn, think about it. We can't raise a baby here. Not in this shoebox. Not when I'm still trying to get the business off the ground. This isn't the right time." She had cried, insisting that every baby was a blessing, but Daniel's reasoning had worn her down. They made the painful decision not to continue the pregnancy. She told herself it was temporary, that once things were stable, they would try again. But fate had other plans. After that, no matter how many doctors she saw, no matter what treatments she endured, pregnancy never came. Evelyn carried the quiet weight of infertility like a stone in her chest, even as she smiled through baby showers for her friends and watched Daniel grow distant whenever the subject of children came up. Still, they carried on. Daniel's company began to flourish, and they moved from their shoebox apartment to a spacious home in the suburbs. From the outside, it looked like the perfect picture of success. Evelyn became the gracious hostess, the devoted wife who kept everything in order, while her husband conquered the business world. But in the quiet moments, those nights when Daniel stayed late at the office, when she lay awake listening to the hollow silence of their childless home, Evelyn wondered if something essential had slipped away from them. Love was still there, but it was muted, dulled by years of disappointment and unspoken resentments. And now this, the cruel irony of it all. Just when she had made peace with their imperfect life, cancer had entered the picture, threatening to take everything. As she pulled into their driveway, Evelyn wiped her eyes and forced herself to breathe steadily. Daniel was still away on business. He had no idea that his world was about to change. She would have to carry the secret until he returned. She would have to be the strong one, even if inside she felt like she was falling apart. In the stillness of their empty home, Evelyn whispered a vow to herself. When he comes back, I'll tell him, and we'll face this together. But deep down, a sliver of doubt gnawed at her. She had seen the look on the doctor's face. She knew what stage 4 meant. She knew that the life they had built together, the promises, the sacrifices, the dreams, might soon unravel faster than she could hold them together. And so she waited, holding the truth like a burning coal in her chest, praying for the strength to do what came next. The house smelled of lemon polish and fresh laundry. Evelyn had spent the morning preparing for Daniel's return, clinging to the small rituals of their marriage. Clean counters, a warm meal ready on the stove, as though order could steady the chaos waiting in her chest. She had decided she would tell him tonight, after he had settled in. The words formed and reformed in her mind. Daniel, the doctors found something. We'll face it together. The sound of keys at the front door pulled her from her thoughts. She hurried into the hallway, her heart racing. Daniel stepped inside, tall, sharp in his tailored suit, but something was different. He didn't come in alone. Behind him stood a young woman with perfectly styled hair, her hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a small boy clutching a toy car. The child had Daniel's dark eyes. Evelyn froze. Daniel, what is this? Daniel shifted uncomfortably, then squared his shoulders. Evelyn, this is Brooke. Brooke Turner. And this, he rested his hand on the boy's back, this is Jacob, my son. The words cut through the air, like glass shattering. Evelyn stared, unable to move, unable to breathe. Your son? Yes, Daniel said firmly, though his voice carried a tremor. I should have told you long ago. Brooke and we've been together for years. I didn't want it to come out like this, but it's time to stop living a lie. Brooke's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile as she guided Jacob further into the foyer, as though she belonged there. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of sacrifice, of waiting, of building. And he had been living another life all along. Evelyn's voice broke. Daniel, you brought her here? Into our home. Our home. Daniel snapped. You've never worked a day for this house. I paid for everything. Every brick, every piece of furniture. It's mine. And now, things are going to change. Brooke and Jacob will live here. You need to pack your things. Her knees buckled. You're telling me to leave? I'll call a taxi, Daniel said coldly, pulling out his phone. You can take what you need and find a place to stay. It's over, Evelyn. It has been for a long time. Brooke ran her hand along the banister, surveying the space with open interest. Jacob, oblivious to the tension, began rolling his toy car across the hallway floor. Evelyn felt her world tilt, collapsing under the weight of betrayal so deep she couldn't even summon tears. She turned toward Daniel, searching his face for any trace of the man she had once loved. But his eyes were steel, fixed on the future he had chosen, a future that didn't include her. Slowly, with trembling hands, Evelyn set her purse on the hallway table. She pulled out a sealed envelope, thick with medical papers. Her voice, when it came, was steady despite the quake in her chest. You should look at this, Daniel. He frowned. What is it? Test results from the Texas Medical Center. I went in your place because you were too busy. They found cancer. Stage 4. The doctors said it's advanced. Daniel's phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. His face drained of color. What are you talking about? Evelyn pressed the envelope into his hands. Read it. See for yourself. For a moment, time stood still. Daniel stared at the documents, his eyes scanning the lines he could barely comprehend. His breath hitched, his shoulders sagging, as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed down on him. Evelyn stepped back, her voice breaking now, the dam of her composure cracking. I was going to tell you tonight. I wanted us to face it together, but you made your choice. So now you can face it with her. She glanced at Brooke, whose smile faltered, unease flickering across her face. Daniel looked up from the papers, his expression torn between shock and disbelief. Evelyn, wait. But she was already lifting her suitcase from the closet, the one she had once packed for vacations and family visits. Only now it was for her exile. She walked past him, past Brooke, past the boy who had no idea his presence had detonated an entire marriage. At the doorway, she paused, forcing herself to meet Daniel's stricken gaze one last time. Goodbye, Daniel. And then she stepped out into the humid Houston evening, the slam of the door echoing like a final verdict. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, the envelope shaking in his hands. His mind spun, Brooke's voice murmuring in the background, Jacob's toy car clattering against the tile. But all he could see were the black letters on the medical report, spelling out a future he wasn't ready to face. Stage 4. Metastasis. No guarantees. He sank onto the nearest chair, the strength draining from him. Evelyn's footsteps were already fading, carried away by the taxi he had called for her only minutes earlier. But now he realized what he had done. He had driven away the one person who might have stood by him through the nightmare ahead. Brooke hovered nearby, frowning at the crumpled papers. What is it, Daniel? What did she give you? He didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was clutch the envelope with trembling hands, as the reality of both his betrayal and his mortality crashed down on him at once. For the first time in years, Daniel Mitchell felt utterly powerless, and Evelyn was gone. The apartment Evelyn found was no bigger than a shoebox, tucked into a low-rise complex on the outskirts of Houston. The walls were thin, the paint peeling, and the hum of traffic from the nearby freeway never seemed to fade. But it was hers. For the first time in her adult life, Evelyn signed her name on a lease without Daniel's hand beside hers. She carried her single suitcase inside and sat on the worn sofa, listening to the silence press in. It wasn't the silence of their old house, filled with echoes of unspoken resentments. This was a different kind of quiet, lonely, yes, but also liberating in its way. No footsteps pacing the hallway, no raised voice telling her she was overreacting, no pointed silences when the subject of children came up. Just the sound of her own breathing and the faint laughter of kids playing in the courtyard below. She had nothing but the clothes in her bag and a few $100s in her purse. Yet, as she sat there, her shoulders sagged with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She was free of him, free and utterly adrift. It was James Whitaker who came to check on her first, Daniel's business partner and longtime friend. James had always been a steady presence in their circle. He was practical, blunt, but not unkind. When he heard what had happened, he showed up at her door with a bag of groceries and an envelope of cash. Evelyn, he said, his voice low but firm, I don't agree with the way Daniel handled this. I can't change what he's done, but I won't see you left with nothing. She blinked back tears. I don't want charity. It's not charity, James replied. It's a loan. You'll pay me back when you can. For now, you need to get on your feet. Behind him, Melissa stood with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the shabby apartment. Melissa had always been quick to speak her mind, and she didn't hide her skepticism now. Evelyn, you need to stop pretending Daniel's coming back. He's made his choice. You've got to think about yourself for once. Evelyn nodded, though the words stung. Melissa was right. Daniel had chosen Brooke and the child, and no amount of hoping would change that. That night, Evelyn opened the envelope James had left. It wasn't much, just enough to cover rent for a couple of months, but it gave her a thread of stability to hold on to. The next morning, she walked into a garment shop downtown, her resume in trembling hands. She hadn't worked since her early 20s, when she had left a seamstress job to support Daniel's long nights and business ambitions. Now, decades later, she stood in front of the factory manager, explaining quietly that she could sew, that she was reliable, that she just needed a chance. The manager, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and calloused hands, looked her up and down. "We're short-staffed. You can start tomorrow. Minimum wage, no benefits." Evelyn swallowed her pride and nodded. "Thank you." On her first day, she sat at the whirring machine, the smell of fabric and oil filling the air. Her fingers stumbled at first, rusty after years away, but soon muscle memory took over. Each stitch felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she had lost. The paycheck was small, but when she held it in her hands at the end of the week, it was hers. Every dollar earned by her own labor. It was humbling, exhausting work. Yet there was dignity in it too. For the first time, Evelyn felt that she was no longer defined by what Daniel provided or denied her. She was building something, however fragile, with her own two hands. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel Mitchell was staging a new beginning. The wedding to Brooke Turner was small but elegant, held in a sleek downtown venue with just a handful of business associates in attendance. Evelyn's absence wasn't mentioned. Brooke smiled dazzlingly in her white gown, clutching Jacob's hand as if cementing her new place in Daniel's world. But beneath the polished surface, shadows lurked. Daniel's illness had not disappeared. The pain gnawed at him in quiet moments, forcing him to slip away to the bathroom during the reception to catch his breath. He ignored the worried glances of James, ignored the whispered questions about his pallor. He told himself that with Brooke by his side, with Jacob to carry his name, he could face anything. Brooke, radiant in the glow of her triumph, seemed unconcerned. She floated through the evening like a queen assuming her throne, her laughter bright, her attention firmly fixed on the wealth and lifestyle she believed she had secured. Daniel raised a glass in a toast, his hand shaking slightly. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice tight. Brooke leaned in, kissing his cheek, and Jacob clapped his small hands, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But when the guests were gone and the music faded, Daniel stood before the mirror in their hotel suite, staring at his reflection. The man looking back was pale, drawn, and tired. He touched his chest, where the ache had returned, sharper than before. He had won Brooke, but he had lost Evelyn. And in the quiet hours of that night, he felt the weight of both choices pressing down like a vice. Back in her tiny apartment, Evelyn finished her shift and walked home with sore fingers and aching shoulders. She opened the window to let in the sticky Houston air, watching the children play below as the city lights flickered on. She was tired, alone, and uncertain about tomorrow. But as she set her modest paycheck on the table, a strange calm settled over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for Daniel to decide her future. The life she had known was gone. Yet in its place, something fragile but real was beginning. The wedding had been modest by Houston standards, just a rented ballroom downtown, a scattering of colleagues, and Brooke radiant in her ivory gown. She glowed with the confidence of a woman who had claimed her prize, parading Jacob in his little suit for the guests to coo over. Daniel stood beside her, smiling through the strain etched into his face, raising his glass when expected, shaking hands, making the kind of small talk that concealed the truth eating away at him inside. "To new beginnings," he had said, his voice carrying across the room. The applause was polite, the champagne fizzing, the air perfumed with flowers and ambition. Only James Whittaker noticed the tremor in Daniel's hand, the way his eyes seemed to cloud when the music grew too loud. After the vows and the toast, after Brooke twirled in her gown for the photographers, they departed for their honeymoon. Brooke had insisted on a week in Cancun, a resort overlooking turquoise water and lined with palm trees. She reveled in the sun, in the drinks served poolside, in the glances of men who still admired her as she strutted across the sand. Daniel tried to keep pace. He sat beneath umbrellas with his laptop open, attempting to project the image of a man still in control, still capable. But each day the fatigue deepened. He felt the sharp stabs in his abdomen when he bent over. He excused himself from dinner more than once, retreating to the bathroom to swallow back nausea. Brooke barely noticed. "Don't be such a downer," she said one evening, tossing her sun hat onto the bed. "We're supposed to be celebrating. You've worked so hard. Can't you relax for once?" Daniel forced a smile, his knuckles white as he gripped the balcony railing. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, glittering under the moonlight, but all he could feel was the heaviness pressing against his ribs. He told himself it was stress, that if he could just make it through the week, he'd find a way to manage the rest. On the fourth day, during a snorkeling excursion, he nearly collapsed trying to climb back onto the boat. A wave of dizziness blurred his vision, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might not make it. Brooke was busy adjusting her bikini straps, laughing with another couple on board, while Daniel slumped onto the deck, clutching his chest. "Are you okay?" one of the tourists asked. "I'm fine," Daniel muttered, forcing himself upright. "Just tired." But his body betrayed him. That night, alone in the bathroom of their hotel suite, he vomited until his hands shook. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, a stranger. When they returned to Houston, the mask crumbled. Daniel collapsed in his office chair 2 days after their return, unable to hide the pain any longer. Brooke found him there, sweat beading on his forehead, his breath ragged. "Daniel, what the hell is going on?" she demanded, irritation lacing her tone rather than concern. He closed his eyes, gathering what little strength he had left. "It's cancer, Brooke. Stage 4. I've known for weeks." For a moment, silence filled the room. Brooke's painted smile faltered, her eyes widening. Then anger sparked in her gaze. "You knew? And you married me anyway? You let me walk into this without telling me." Daniel's voice was hoarse. "I didn't want to lose you. I thought maybe there was time. Maybe we could still build something before." "Before what?" "Before you die." Brooke's words were sharp, slicing through the air. She threw her hands up, pacing the length of the room. "God, Daniel, do you realize what this means for me? I didn't sign up to be your nurse. I have a life to live." He looked at her, stunned. "I thought you loved me." "I love the life we could have had," she snapped. "The trips, the dinners, the house. Not this. Not sitting around waiting for you to waste away." Jacob padded into the room then, clutching his toy car, sensing the tension. "Mom," he whispered. Brooke spun around, her face softening only for her son. "Go back to your room, honey. Mommy and Daniel are talking." The boy retreated quietly, and Daniel sank deeper into his chair. The truth was out now, laid bare like an open wound. He had gambled everything, his marriage, his health, his dignity, on a fantasy of a new beginning. And now, with Brooke's fury echoing off the walls, he saw it for what it was, an illusion. She wasn't going to be the partner who held his hand through treatments, who stayed up during long nights of pain, who whispered words of hope when the prognosis darkened. Evelyn had been that person, and he had cast her aside. Brooke stood by the window, arms crossed, her expression cold. "You should have told me before the wedding. You should have given me a choice." Daniel bowed his head. The envelope Evelyn had left still haunting his memory. He had been given a choice, and he had made the wrong one. The silence between them stretched, heavy with finality. Brooke reached for her phone, scrolling through her messages, her mind already elsewhere. Daniel sat alone in the fading light of the room, the weight of his illness pressing harder than ever. The illusion of his new life had shattered, leaving only the truth. He was sick, and the woman he had chosen would not save him. The weeks that followed stripped Daniel of the illusion that he could still control his life. The sharp pains became constant companions, gnawing at him when he tried to eat, when he tried to sleep, even when he tried to sit upright at his desk. His once commanding voice thinned to a rasp. The weight melted from his frame, leaving him gaunt and pale. Doctors at the Texas Medical Center had reviewed his scans again, this time with words that left no room for denial. "Mr. Mitchell," the oncologist said gently, "the disease has progressed. Aggressive treatments may only prolong suffering. At this stage, hospice care might be the best option, for comfort, for dignity." Hospice. The word lodged in Daniel's chest like a shard of glass. He nodded mutely, unwilling to let the doctor see his despair. At home, Brooke listened to the update with a detached frown. She scrolled through her phone while the oncologist spoke, her nails tapping impatiently against the armrest of her chair. When the appointment ended, she slipped her sunglasses on and muttered, "So that's it? You're just waiting to die." "Brooke," Daniel whispered, reaching for her hand. "I need you. I can't do this alone." But her hand remained limp in his grasp. She pulled away, her lips curling with frustration. "I didn't sign up for this, Daniel. I didn't come into your life to watch it end." The words struck harder than the diagnosis itself. He turned his face away, swallowing back the lump in his throat. As his strength failed, Brooke's distance grew. She went out more often, leaving Jacob with the television to babysit him. Daniel would hear her laughter drift in from the driveway as she spoke to friends on the phone, her voice vibrant and carefree in a way it never was inside the house. One evening, after administering his prescribed morphine injection, she set the syringe back on the counter and looked at him with cold finality. "I can't do this anymore," she said flatly. Daniel's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "You'll get a nurse. James can help you figure it out. But I'm done." She tossed her handbag over her shoulder, calling for Jacob. The boy appeared in the doorway, his toy car clutched in his hand, eyes wide with confusion. "Mommy." Brooke crouched briefly, brushing a hand over his hair. "Stay with Daniel for now. Mommy will be back later." But Daniel knew the truth. He watched as she walked out the door, her heels clicking against the tile, her perfume lingering in the air. The front door slammed shut, leaving him in silence, broken only by Jacob's small voice. "Where's Mommy going?" Daniel forced a smile for his son. "She just needs some time, buddy." But his chest tightened with grief. He had been abandoned, left to face the slow unraveling of his life with only a child too young to understand. Days blurred together. Daniel tried to care for Jacob, preparing simple meals when he could stand long enough, reading bedtime stories even as his voice cracked with pain. But each day grew harder. Sometimes he couldn't get out of bed at all. Jacob would crawl beside him, clutching his father's hand, whispering, "It's okay, Daddy. I'm here." Finally, with shame burning in his chest, Daniel called James. "I need help," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I can't do this on my own. Jacob, he deserves better than this." James came that evening, his broad frame filling the doorway. He surveyed Daniel's frail body and the unkempt state of the house with a grim expression. "You should have told me sooner," he said quietly. "I didn't want to admit it," Daniel confessed. His eyes flicked toward Jacob, who was asleep on the couch. "But I can't even take care of my own son anymore." James sighed, pulling out his phone. "I know someone. She's retired now, but she still works part-time as a nurse aide. Kind woman. Reliable. She'll help with Jacob too." True to his word, the next day a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Green arrived. She spoke softly, her presence calm and steady as she prepared Daniel's medications and fixed meals for Jacob. She didn't flinch at the sight of sickness or at Daniel's occasional outbursts of frustration. She simply carried on, her quiet competence a lifeline in the storm. For the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself to exhale. At least Jacob wouldn't go hungry. At least someone was there to hold things together when he couldn't. Yet at night, when the house was quiet and Mrs. Green had gone home, The memories came flooding back. Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by Evelyn's face. He remembered the way she used to tuck a blanket around his shoulders when he fell asleep at his desk, the way her voice softened when she called his name, the way she had pressed that envelope into his hands before walking out the door. He had chosen Brooke. He had chosen lies and fleeting comfort over the one person who had truly stood by him. Now Brooke was gone and Evelyn, his Evelyn, was out there somewhere, living her life without him. Regret gnawed at him with a fierceness the disease could not match. He wanted to see her, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. One night, as Mrs. Green dimmed the lights and Jacob settled into bed, Daniel whispered into the darkness, "Evelyn, please, just let me see you one more time." The silence that followed was unbearable. Only the faint sound of his son's breathing reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone. But in his heart, Daniel knew the truth. The woman who might have saved him had already been cast aside. And now, all he could do was wait. Wait for the chance to make things right before it was too late. Daniel dialed Evelyn's number with trembling hands. It was late evening, the house dim and quiet except for Jacob's soft breathing in the next room. The nurse aide had already left for the night, and Daniel sat alone in his chair, the glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the living room. His voice cracked when she finally answered. "Evelyn, it's me." There was a pause, heavy, uncertain. He imagined her frowning, uncertain whether to hang up. "I know I don't deserve to ask this," he continued, each word weighted with shame, "but I need to see you. Just once. I don't have much time left." On the other end, Evelyn's voice was quiet, hesitant. "Daniel, please," he whispered. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just let me see you. For Jacob's sake, if not for mine." Evelyn closed her eyes, torn between anger, grief, and compassion. She had rebuilt her life piece by piece, but Daniel's voice still carried the weight of 10 years of marriage, of memories she could not erase. Finally, she exhaled. "All right, I'll come tomorrow evening." Relief surged through him, fragile and fleeting. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't know what this means." The next day, Evelyn finished her shift at the garment shop, her body aching from hours at the sewing machine. She changed into a clean blouse and slipped the strap of her purse over her shoulder, her heart racing at the thought of seeing Daniel again. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't know if she could look at him without remembering the betrayal. But some part of her still needed closure, still needed to face him one last time. The sun had set by the time she left her apartment. The narrow stairwell smelled of cigarettes and stale beer. As she stepped into the courtyard, she noticed Frank Doyle leaning against the railing outside his unit. He was drunk again, a bottle dangling from his hand, his eyes glassy. "Evenin', sweetheart," he slurred, blocking her path. "I don't have time, Frank." "Move," Evelyn said firmly, clutching her purse tighter. But Frank staggered forward, his grin twisting. "Always so high and mighty. Where you off to? Dressed up like that. Gonna meet some man." She tried to sidestep him, but he grabbed her arm, yanking her back. Fear shot through her veins. "Let me go." Instead, he snatched at her purse, tugging violently. Evelyn resisted, but Frank shoved her hard against the wall. Her head struck the concrete with a sickening crack. Pain exploded behind her eyes. The world tilted. Her purse tore free from her grasp as Frank stumbled away with it, muttering curses before disappearing into the night. Evelyn slid to the ground, her vision blurring, warm blood trickling down her temple. Voices around her grew muffled, distant. Someone screamed for help. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was the flicker of ambulance lights turning into the complex. That same evening, Daniel sat by the window, staring at the driveway. He had tidied the house with what little strength he had, making sure Jacob's toys were stacked neatly in the corner. He wore a clean shirt, though it hung loosely on his frame, and combed his thinning hair with trembling hands. He kept glancing at the clock, willing the minutes to pass faster, waiting for the sound of her car pulling up. But the driveway remained empty. 9 o'clock came, then 10, midnight. Still no Evelyn. He called her phone again and again, but the line rang without answer. His chest tightened, a mixture of panic and despair. She's not coming. Brooke's voice echoed in his memory, mocking him. She doesn't want you anymore. Daniel lowered the phone onto the table, his hand shaking. Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them back, unwilling to cry in front of Jacob. Instead, he shuffled into his son's room, watching the boy sleep peacefully beneath his blanket. Daniel brushed a strand of hair from Jacob's forehead, whispering, "At least, I still have you." But even as he said it, loneliness hollowed him out. He had clung to the hope of seeing Evelyn, of hearing her voice in person one last time, and now it was gone. He told himself maybe she had changed her mind. Maybe she couldn't bear to look at him. The truth was bleeding out in a hospital room across town, but Daniel would never know it. Days passed. Daniel grew weaker, his body betraying him faster than before. The nurse aide returned each morning to help with medications and meals, but at night, when the house fell silent, he was haunted by Evelyn's absence. "She didn't come because she couldn't forgive me," he murmured to James during one visit. James tried to reassure him. "You don't know that. Maybe something happened." But Daniel shook his head. "No, she made her choice, just like I made mine." His health declined sharply after that. Some nights he struggled to breathe, clutching the sheets as though they might anchor him to this world. And still, he turned his gaze to the window, waiting for the figure who never appeared. The memory of Evelyn's voice on the phone, the softness, the hesitation, the promise was all he had left. He replayed it again and again in his mind, each time a little fainter, until even that began to slip away. One night, as Jacob slept in the next room, Daniel lay in bed, his body frail, his skin clammy. He whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible. "Evelyn, I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you that." The silence pressed back, heavy and unyielding. He closed his eyes, feeling the last of his strength drain away. He had lost her once by betrayal. Now he lost her again by fate. And in that cruel symmetry, Daniel Mitchell surrendered to the truth that would haunt him until his final breath. He had been left alone, abandoned not just by the woman he chose, but by the woman he cast aside, the only one who might have stayed. The call came on a gray morning. Daniel Mitchell slipped away quietly in his bed, his breath shallow until they stopped altogether. The nurse aide was the one who found him. Jacob curled at his side, clutching his father's limp hand. News traveled quickly. Within days, a modest service was arranged at a funeral home in Houston. The casket was closed, Daniel's body too frail at the end to be remembered that way. The room smelled faintly of lilies, the air thick with murmurs of colleagues who had known him in business, not in weakness. James Whitaker stood at the back of the chapel, his jaw tight as he watched Brooke sweep in, dressed in black, her heels clicking against the tile. She carried herself with the self-assurance of someone who wanted to be seen, not someone in mourning. Jacob trailed behind her, bewildered and subdued, clinging to the toy car his father had once bought him. When the service ended and the guests dispersed, James approached Brooke. "Jacob's staying with me for now. He's been through enough." Brooke's eyes narrowed. "He's my son. He comes with me." "You abandoned him, Brooke. You abandoned both of them." Her laugh was sharp, cold. "You think the court cares about that? I'm his mother. That's all that matters. Legally, you don't stand a chance." James clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout in the quiet hallway of the funeral home. "We'll see about that," he muttered, his voice low and steady. Across town, Evelyn Mitchell was discharged from the hospital. The head injury from Frank Doyle's attack had kept her confined for weeks, a blur of white ceilings, beeping monitors, and cautious nurses. She had wanted to reach Daniel, to tell him she hadn't abandoned him, but her body had betrayed her and time had run out. When she finally stepped outside, the September air was warm and heavy, carrying the distant hum of traffic. Her friend from the garment shop drove her home, chattering nervously, but Evelyn barely heard a word. Her mind clung to one thought: Daniel is gone. She hadn't been there. She hadn't been able to hold his hand, to speak the words she had rehearsed so many nights in her mind. He had died thinking she had chosen not to come. The grief hollowed her out, heavier than the bruises on her body or the stitches at her temple. 2 days later, Evelyn walked slowly down the street near the funeral home, her steps unsteady but determined. She had no intention of attending the service. Too much history, too many eyes, but she needed to see, even from a distance. That was where she saw James. He was standing outside by the steps, Jacob at his side, the boy's small hand tucked into his. "James!" Evelyn called softly. He turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Evelyn, you're out." She nodded, her eyes drifting to the boy. "That's Jacob." James's expression softened. "Yes, Daniel's son. He doesn't really understand what happened." Evelyn crouched carefully, her movements still stiff from her injuries. "Hi, Jacob. I'm Evelyn." The boy looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes before glancing up at James for reassurance. Then, shyly, he nodded. When Jacob wandered a few steps away, pushing his toy car along the pavement, Evelyn turned back to James. "Who's taking care of him now?" James exhaled heavily. "I am. For now. But Brooke's back. She wants custody." "Brooke." Evelyn's voice tightened. She left Daniel when he needed her most. Left Jacob too. But the law, James shook his head. She's still his mother. That counts for more than it should. Evelyn's heart twisted. "So what happens now?" "I'll fight her," James said firmly. "I can't let Jacob go back to that woman. But it won't be easy. Custody battles never are." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything pressing between them. Evelyn's eyes stung as she watched Jacob giggle softly, spinning his toy car in circles on the concrete. He was innocent, caught in the crossfire of choices he hadn't made. James glanced at her, his voice quieter now. "Daniel wanted to see you before he died. He talked about you, Evelyn. He regretted what he did." Her throat closed. She looked away, blinking back tears. "I tried. I was on my way. But," she touched the faint scar at her temple, "I didn't make it." James nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Then maybe this is your chance. Not to fix the past, but to help what's left of it. That boy needs someone who actually cares." Evelyn's gaze returned to Jacob, her heart heavy with sorrow but stirred by something else too. A flicker of purpose, fragile but undeniable. For years, she had lived defined by Daniel's choices, his betrayals, his ambitions. Now he was gone. What remained was a child, a chance to do right by someone who had been left behind, just as she had. As Jacob's laughter echoed down the quiet street, Evelyn felt the first stirrings of resolve. Inside the funeral home, Brooke signed papers with the funeral director, her expression brisk, her tone businesslike. She was already calculating her next move, her next life, her next opportunity. But outside on the steps, Evelyn and James stood together, watching over the boy who had lost both parents in different ways. Neither of them knew how the battle ahead would unfold. But one thing was certain: Jacob deserved better than Brooke. And for the first time since Daniel's betrayal, Evelyn felt she had something left to fight for. The custody hearing took place in a sterile courtroom in downtown Houston, the kind of place where lives were decided in neat files and legal jargon. Brooke arrived in a sleek black dress, her makeup flawless, her expression a mask of wounded motherhood. She clutched Jacob's birth certificate as if it were a shield, her attorney at her side. James sat across the aisle, his suit pressed but his face tense. Beside him, Evelyn sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't there to testify about herself, but about what she had seen, what Brooke had done, or rather, what she had failed to do. When the judge called the case, Brooke's attorney stood first. "Your Honor, my client, Brooke Turner, is the biological mother of Jacob Turner. She seeks to resume custody of her son after a temporary lapse due to personal stress." Stress, James muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. When it was his turn, James rose, his voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, Brooke Turner abandoned her son. She left him alone with a terminally ill man who could barely care for himself. She knew Daniel was dying and she walked away. Jacob was left without meals, without basic care, and without his mother. If not for outside intervention, that boy could have been neglected beyond repair." Brooke shifted in her seat, her expression twisting. "That's not true," she snapped. "I had my reasons. Daniel, he tricked me. He didn't tell me he was sick until after we married. I was blindsided. I couldn't handle it." James's attorney pressed forward. "So you left your 5-year-old son with a dying man?" Brooke's silence was damning. Then Evelyn took the stand. She spoke softly, her words heavy with conviction. "I was Daniel's wife for 10 years. I know the difference between hardship and abandonment. Brooke had a choice. She chose herself. Jacob deserves better than to be a convenience when it suits her and a burden when it doesn't." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge seemed to weigh Evelyn's words carefully. After a moment, he nodded. "We will involve Child Protective Services for a home study. But based on the evidence and testimony, custody will not be returned to Ms. Turner at this time." Brooke's face hardened, her eyes flashing with rage. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but her attorney placed a hand on her arm, shaking his head. Jacob was placed in James's care officially, and though the process was not final, the weight in the boy's eyes seemed to lift the moment he realized he would not be forced back into Brooke's arms. Life settled into a new rhythm. James moved Evelyn into his home, not out of romance at first, but out of practicality. Jacob needed stability, and neither of them wanted the boy to feel shuffled between temporary places. Evelyn's gentle presence softened the edges of James's stern household. She cooked meals, helped with homework, and soothed Jacob's nightmares when memories of his father's illness crept in. In the evenings, after Jacob was asleep, Evelyn and James would sit on the porch, the humid Houston air wrapping around them, cicadas humming in the distance. At first, they spoke of logistics, school, doctor visits, groceries. But slowly, the conversations deepened. James told her about the years he had spent trying to keep Daniel's business afloat, the frustration of watching his friend make choices that destroyed him. Evelyn shared the quiet ache of her marriage, the dreams of children that never came, the devastation of betrayal. One night, James said quietly, "You know, Daniel talked about you near the end. He regretted what he'd done." Evelyn looked out at the darkened street, her voice soft. "It doesn't change what happened, but maybe it matters that he knew." James nodded. "It matters." For Jacob, the healing came slowly but surely. He began to laugh again, his toy cars racing across the living room floor, his drawings filling the fridge door. He called James Uncle at first, then simply Dad, one evening without even thinking. James's eyes had brimmed with tears, though he said nothing. For Evelyn, the healing was quieter but just as profound. She found herself waking each day with purpose, her grief reshaped into strength. She hadn't been able to save her marriage or her husband, but she could pour love into this boy who needed it most. She could transform her own brokenness into a foundation for someone else's future. There were still difficult moments. Court dates, paperwork, Brooke's occasional attempts to reinsert herself into Jacob's life. But together, Evelyn and James stood firm. They weren't bound by old illusions anymore. They were bound by something stronger, the determination to protect the child who had been left behind. One golden afternoon, the three of them sat together in the backyard. The air was thick with the smell of barbecue from a neighbor's grill, and Jacob's laughter rang out as he chased fireflies with a jar. Evelyn sat on the porch steps, a glass of iced tea in her hand, watching the boy run barefoot through the grass. James joined her, lowering himself onto the step beside her with a quiet sigh. "You know," he said, his gaze fixed on Jacob, "for everything that went wrong, maybe something went right. He's smiling again. That's what matters." Evelyn followed his gaze, her chest swelling with a mixture of sorrow and peace. "He's the reason I survived this. All of it." James turned to her, his voice softer now. "You did more than survive. You gave him back his childhood." Evelyn smiled, faintly, the weight in her heart easing. "And he gave me back my life." As the sun dipped lower, painting the Houston sky in shades of orange and pink, Jacob ran to them, his jar glowing with tiny sparks of light. He held it up proudly. "Look, Evelyn. Look, Dad." They both leaned in, marveling at the fireflies flickering in the glass. Evelyn wrapped an arm around Jacob, pulling him close, while James rested a hand gently on her shoulder. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt whole. The pain of betrayal, the scars of loss, the shadows of regret, they hadn't vanished, but they had been transformed. In their place stood a new family, fragile but strong, forged not from promises broken, but from love chosen. The night air was alive with laughter and light, and in that moment, Evelyn knew she had found her closure. Not in Daniel's regrets, not in the past she could never change, but in the future she was building now. With James, with Jacob, with herself. And as the fireflies danced in the fading Houston twilight, she finally felt at peace.